Welcome. We are now going to move our attention to the other English empiricist, George Berkeley. And then we'll kind of have a quick wrap up at the end to try to understand who's Locke, who's Berkeley, and where do Hume's ideas come back into this. George Berkeley is a rather intriguing character, especially when we look at his life in context of being an empiricist. He'll disagree with many of the ideas of Locke, but still hold the idea that there's nothing innate in our understanding of the universe around us. He was born in 1685 in Kilkenny, Ireland, and will die in 1753. He'll become an Anglican priest in 1710, and his major works are an essay towards a new theory of vision, a treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge, and 3 dialogues between Hylas and Philonous. He'll spend a good amount of his time in his life setting up a school in Bermuda that would prepare Native Americans to missionize their fellow natives in America. He'll take his duty as a priest rather seriously. This will also include some time spent in Newport, Rhode Island, until he gets recalled when he is named the Bishop of Ceylon, a small diocese near Cork, in 1734. He's best known for articulating the principle that esse is percepi, or to be is to be perceived. That you know things because you see them, you perceive them, and that's how things are. And that's what makes them be. This is the basis for all of our human knowledge. Again, it's coming through our sense data, right? It's being perceived. And this also, according to Berkeley, demonstrates the existence of God, an argument that we'll make later on in this discussion. He'll disagree with Locke's claim that we can form abstract ideas from particulars and from sensed ideas. For Berkeley, we always understand the idea in its particular. Therefore, there are no abstract ideas. Key to understanding Berkeley is this idea of esse is percepi, right? To be is to be perceived. There are no abstract ideas. Therefore, our idea of a triangle necessitates a particular triangle. We have a thing in our mind when we say triangle. We cannot abstract an idea of an angle outside of the essence of a particular triangle. So in our mind, we construct one. You cannot think of 3 angles in a single object without envisioning in your mind a triangle. It's not an abstraction. It's a mental perception, even if it only exists in your mind. Even if the particular is only a recollection of a triangle, this is where it is to be found. All things, even those we apprehend, even perceptions, have their beginnings in their being perceived. Therefore, if a tree falls in the forest and no one is there, does it make a sound? No, it does not for Berkeley. If there is nobody there to perceive it, then it doesn't exist. This means there's not a separate world of ideas like Plato, but that the ideas are perceptions that exist only in our mind or in the minds of others. Ideas are only ideas, and reality is only found in these ideas. It's not a separate world like Plato. It's a very different construction than what we've seen before, and is a little hard to fully grasp in many ways. He is an empiricist, but many ideas are contrary to Locke, as we have already seen. There are no secondary or primary qualities in objects, as Locke argued. Things don't exist in themselves, but only in our minds, that is, our perceptions of them. All ideas must exist in a mental substance, that is, in the mind or spirit, if you'd prefer. Idea is the best term that he uses because we understand ideas that exist in the mind. But what about ideas that are, as of yet, unperceived by me, you might be asking, which would be a very valid question to ask. What can I say about the desk in the room next door that I've never been in? What does the anti-abstraction principle, as this is understood, say about this? Does it simply not exist because it's in another room and I'm not there? Does it only exist when I'm thinking about it? Does it cease to exist when I'm not thinking about it or not seeing it or perceiving it? Two answers he gives do not really make his detractors too happy, and therefore they might not make you, a skeptic of these ideas in all likelihood, too happy. It says the answer is that you're asking about it. Therefore, you have perceived it, at least in your imagination. The desk, therefore, is not abstracted, but perceived. The fact that you're asking about the desk in the next room means that you're using your imagination to construct a desk in the next room. You're recollecting ideas of desks and how they've been. You're looking at the desks in the room you're currently in and supposing that the desk in the next room would resemble it in some way. Therefore, it's already existing in your mind. You're creating it from your imagination. Ideas exist in the mind and recall perception. Therefore, it exists there. So this may or may not work for you. The other answer he gives is one that we'll get into greater detail later, that God is always aware of things. Therefore, God keeps things from vanishing in and out of existence. Again, we'll get into that in greater detail later in some of the challenges and ideas behind this idea that he lays out, that there's something that's at least observing it. This also, by the way, will bring up ideas of Schrodinger's cat. This is a thought experiment where you place a cat in a box with poison that has a possibility of killing the cat. You have a timer in the box that will break a vial which will contain poison. And therefore, until you open the box, the fate of the cat is unknown. Therefore, the cat is in an indeterminable state. It is simultaneously alive and dead. This is the thought experiment of Schrödinger, not that of Berkeley. For Schrödinger, the cat is indeterminable. It is simultaneously alive and dead. Only when the box is open and we perceive the state of the cat is the fate of the cat actually determined. Later idealists thought of Berkeley as an early idealist in some ways. Idealists kind of liked some of this indeterminable state ideas that we'll see later with Schrödinger, and this idea that you only understand things through perception. So in some ways we have Berkeley not only as an empiricist, but also as a sort of proto-idealist. Again, idealism borrows from these ideas, so it's not that crazy, right? They really liked the idea that the world was totally mental and did not really consist of non-mental reality. So where does this anti-abstraction principle and other ideas come from? Let's turn our attention now to his work, The Principles of Human Knowledge. In the introduction, he starts off by saying philosophy is just the study of wisdom and truth. This is the aim of philosophy, according to Berkeley, to know what is wise and what is true. He also points out that most people are not philosophers. The illiterate majority of people who walk the high road of plain common sense are governed by the dictates of nature and mostly comfortable and undisturbed. They don't complain of any lack of certainty in their senses, are in no danger of becoming skeptics. But when we lay the blame for our paradoxes and difficulties on our faculties rather than our own wrong use of them, perhaps we are letting ourselves down too lightly. It is hard to believe that right deductions form true principles should ever lead to conclusions that can't be maintained or made consistent. What do we do with paradoxes? Are paradoxes due to themselves or our own limitations? We don't know what to do with a paradox. We are uncertain of an outcome because it's paradoxical. But does this mean that it should be ignored? Right. If I have a list of things to do and the only thing to do on my list is nothing, and I cross that off of my list, now I have nothing to do, which is the very thing I need to do. So it's not done. Right? Can one thing say it's true and the other thing say that it was false and still be true? What do we do with things like the ship of Theseus and other examples of the same thing, right? That on the journey, every part of the ship got replaced. Is it the same ship that left the harbor? If we replace all the pieces one at a time, we kind of think that the essence of the ship goes with it, but yet none of the parts are the same. Is it truly the same ship that left the harbor? What if all these other parts were gathered up and used to construct a new ship along the way? Would we now have two ships of Theses? Right? How does that work? Is that okay? And could this be a process that then goes on to all infinity? Is there an actual ship? Right? These are paradoxes of thought, and you might have answers to them. You might go yes, no, absolutely not, right, or whatever. But is it our own limitations, or is it in themselves? Most common people don't stop and think about these, right? Most people are not philosophers. This is the challenge and the opportunity that we have in this class. We are uncertain of an outcome because it's paradoxical. Most people just ignore it. Philosophers need to spend a little bit more time on these ideas. Berkeley states that his purpose, therefore, is to try to discover what the underlying sources are of all that doubtfulness and uncertainty, those absurdities and contradictions into which various sects of philosophy has fallen. Moving on, he states, if anyone who surveys the objects of human knowledge, they will easily see that they are all ideas that come from one of three places. First is that they would be imprinted on our senses, right? Our sense data takes in the world. This is classic empiricist understanding of the world, right? Or two, they are perceived by our own emotions and mental activity, right? We have our own mind, and that we are going to say things that we like, and we're going to perceive things based off of that. Or three, they are formed out of ideas of these two types, your emotions and mental activities, in addition to your sense data, with the help of memory and imagination. So we're able to produce imaginations, and these are, again, objects that we are creating in our mind. They are not simply abstractions. Imagination is construction of different objects, just as Inside Out's Bing Bong there is a construction of a raccoon, an elephant, and a whole host of other odd things, right? It is just putting other things together, and then there's a concreteness that's then put these things together. Right? We compound and divide things, or we reduce ideas of one of these other kinds. This is what we do. We have three options for how we know things, therefore. We gain it from sense data, understood in our mind, find it in our minds, or remember or imagine things. And here, we're not just talking about sense data as external, but understanding sense data within our minds and the fact that it lives all within our minds. Two, we also perceive things through attending to our own emotions and our minds. We do have a connection here with Descartes and Bonaventure, if we wanted to kind of make and draw this connection out a little bit more, right? That We decide if we like something or not, and we perceive it within our own minds as well as our external data. If we like something, we're going to perceive it as better for us than if we don't like something, right? There is this basic problem of confirmation bias that exists within our minds. We look at something and we are going to evaluate an argument or an object. We're going to say that's a tree because it looks like a tree, because my understanding is that a tree, or no, that's not a tree, it's an ugly cell phone tower. And again, the difference between the cell phone tower and an artificial Christmas tree, of which we might ascribe treeness to one but not to the other, is size, utility, something, right? It's questionable. So again, why we're deciding one or the other is about our perception and our attending to our own emotions within our minds. And then we form these ideas from both sense data and our impressions, our memories, and our imagination. Berkeley continues, by sight, I have ideas of light and colors with their different degrees and variations. By touch, I perceive hard and soft, heat and cold, motion and resistance, and so on. And each of these also admits of differences of quality or degree. Smelling supplies me with odors, the palette of tastes, and hearing conveys sound to the mind and all of the variety of tone and composition. We have our senses, and it informs us about the world around it, but it's all about our own perceptions still. And when a number of these are observed to accompany each other, they come to be marked by one name, and thus are thought of as one thing. For example, a certain color, taste, smell, shape, and consistency have been observed to go together. They are taken in to be one distinct thing called an apple. It's the right color, although there's a variety of colors for apples. It's the right size, even though there's a variety of sizes of apples. It's the right shape. More or less, there's one major shape. Taste, varieties of taste, but we all have these things, right? All of our senses go in here, and now we call this thing an apple. Other collections of ideas will constitute a stone or a tree, a book, or a simple perceptible thing. And these can arouse the emotions of love, hate, joy, grief, and so on, depending on whether they please or displease us. Again, we have the idea of objects pleasing us or not. We are not addressing the idea of apprehension as much as Descartes and Bonaventure would, but we do have reflection based upon collections of what Kant would identify as categories of knowledge. We see Kant trying to bridge, again, empiricism and rationalism in some ways, using some of these arguments of Berkeley. And not that everything gets reduced to Kant, but looking at Locke and Berkeley, we're able to understand the fuller worldview of Kant and what he was trying to do. We would notice very clearly that none of this was intrinsic to our understanding. Everything came from the senses. Right? We're not a rationalist saying this is due to our rational nature that we understand a tree or an apple or some other idea. He continues saying, as well as all those endless variety of ideas or objects of knowledge, there is also something that knows or perceives them. Right? There is still you, though it's not holding this innate knowledge, and acts on them in various ways as willing, imagining, and remembering. This perceiving active entity is what he calls the mind or spirit or soul or myself. All of these words are equal in many different ways. These words don't refer to any one of my ideas, but rather to something entirely distinct from them, something in which they exist or by which they are perceived. Those two are equivalent because the existence of an idea consists in its being perceived. Once again, we return to this esse est percipi principle, right? This is the central idea of Berkeley. Things exist because of the perception of them. If something happens and no one perceives it, It simply did not happen. Except, you would point out that someone always does perceive it, which we'll get to later. Right? Things are always perceived, or at least it's necessary that something always perceives of it, even if it's not you or another person. Everyone will agree that our thoughts, emotions, and ideas, he continues, of the imagination exist only in the mind. The mind is where things exist. Probably good to stop and just ask yourself, do you agree that your thoughts, emotions, and ideas of the imagination exist in the mind? You probably do. You might have a certain hesitation on, agreeing to any philosophical stance, which would be, appropriate given the fact that we have so many different ideas thrown at us. But you probably agree that your thoughts exist in your mind. They don't exist in my mind or in concrete objects outside of you. Your thought of the rock probably doesn't come from the rock, because you would also say that the rock has no mind in itself, doesn't know itself, it simply is. Is it that only, though, because you perceive it? Berkeley continues, it seems to me equally obvious that the various sensations or ideas that are imprinted on our senses cannot exist except in a mind that perceives them, no matter how they are blended or combined together. That is, no matter what objects they constitute. And a rock doesn't have any sense of the rock, and yet the idea of a rock, and that only exists in perception. Therefore, it only exists in your mind or in the mind of others as they perceive it. You can know this intuitively, he says, by attending to what is meant to be with this term exist when it is applied to perceptible things. The table that I'm writing on exists. That is, I see it and feel it. And if I were out of my study, I would say that it existed, meaning that if I were in my study, I would indeed perceive it, or that some other spirit actually perceives it. And the table exists in your mind, or in the mind of somebody else. For unthinking things to exist is to be perceived. So they couldn't possibly exist out of the minds or thinking things that perceive them. The table only exists because you're thinking of it. Things only exist when they are perceived. When the mind is engaged upon them, there is no unperceived table or tree. If you don't think about the apple, because you haven't for a while on this slide, it ceases to exist. And it's simply gone, vanished. Its existence disappears. It is indeed widely believed that all perceptible objects, houses, mountains, rivers, and so on, really exist independently of being perceived by the understanding. But however widely and confidently this belief may be held, anyone who has the courage to challenge it will, if I'm not mistaken, says Berkeley, see that it involves an obvious contradiction. For what are houses, mountains, rivers, etc., but things we perceive by sense? A house, a mountain, a river, a tree, a table, an apple, all exist in that they are perceived. They do not find existence anywhere else. And what do we perceive besides our own ideas and sensations? The only thing that's perceiving is the object which perceives, right, from the mind, which is separate from these objects and is the thing that is perceiving them. And isn't it plainly contradictory that these either singularly or in combination should exist unperceived? It says if you're not perceiving it, you all have to agree that it likely doesn't exist. At least initially, because you don't have any knowledge that it exists, at least exists outside of the mind, if we want to go back into this sort of Anselmian argument of is it better to exist in reality or only in the mind? You don't know that it exists in reality if you're not perceiving it. It only exists at this point in your mind. And reality is its own large question. Where do you actually see or know things? In the mind. You already agreed to that earlier, remember? Trees exist only in the mind. They don't exist anywhere else. Berkeley continues. Light and colors, heat and cold, extension and shapes. In a word, the things that we see and feel, what we get from our senses, right? And what our mind thinks about. What are they but so many sensations, notions, ideas, or sense impressions? And can any of these be separated even in thought from perception? Can you actually think of something existing without any sort of perception that at least was the basis for it? Again, this is where he and Locke would agree. So how do they exist then? From what I have said, he says, it follows that only substances are spirits that things perceive. But you say, though the ideas don't exist outside the mind, still they may be things like them of which they are copies or resemblances, and these things may exist outside of the mind in an unthinking substance. I answer that the only thing an idea can resemble is another idea. A color or shape can't be like anything but another color or shape. Right? This is the difficulty many of us have with Berkeley. Right? We do say, like he brings up, that the ideas might not exist outside of mind, but they're probably copies or resemblances of things that actually objectively do exist. And he says, no, ideas are only ideas. You don't move from one thing to another. A tree is not a rock. It's of a different substance. Ideas only exist in the mind. You don't get an idea about something. Your sensations, your impressions of things are not the things themselves. This isn't the way things go. Everything, therefore, only exists as idea. Some philosophers, he says, distinguish between primary qualities from secondary ones. Locke, for instance, made this argument earlier. They use the former term to stand for extension, shape, motion, rest, solidity, and number. And the later term they denote to all other perceptible qualities such as colors, tastes, sounds, and so on, as we addressed with Locke, right? That for Locke, there were some ideas that existed in the object and some things that only existed from our perception of it. Berkeley says, well, Locke, you're going down the right idea that everything's in the mind, but you're trying to separate objective side from subjectivity, and that is where you're wrong, right? That colors exist not as a secondary quality by my own perception, but everything exists like colors from my own perception. But I have seen already shown that extension, shape, motion are quite clearly nothing but ideas existing in the mind, and that an idea can't be like anything but another idea, and that consequently neither they nor things from which they are copied can exist in an unperceiving substance. So the very notion of a so-called matter or corporeal substance clearly involves a contradiction. There is no such thing as matter. Matter doesn't exist. As he said earlier, it follows that the only things of substance are spirits. Everything is just idea floating around. Again, this is a little tricky for us to always agree with, but we probably at least know where he's going on with this. Right? The idea that things exist in matter, he says, is unnecessary and still only mental formulations. Everything exists in the mind through perception and exists therefore only in the mind. Look in at yourself, he says, and see whether you can perform a mental abstraction that enables you to conceive of a body's being extended and moving without having any other perceptible qualities. Can you think of a thing and it have no color? Can you even think of a flower without the smell? Probably not. Maybe you can, but then the second I introduce that there is a smell, your mind is thinking back upon the smell. And that is where these things exist. Right? In short, extension, shape, motion are all abstracted from all other qualities. This is inconceivable. There are qualities that exist upon the objects as they are perceived and do not exist as secondary characterizations. The same is true for all comparisons. Once again, we're comparing an object, its size, its shape. It's all about how we're perceiving it. Everything is in perception, not just some qualities of it. Here's a further point about extension and motion, he argues. Large and small, fast and slow are generally agreed to exist only in the mind. Right? Locke even conceded this. That is because they are entirely relative. Whether something is large or small, or whether it moves quickly or slowly, depends on the condition or location of the sense organs of the perceiver. So there is extension outside of the mind. It must be neither large nor small, and extramental motion must be neither fast nor slow. I conclude, therefore, that there is no such extension or motion. Everything is perception. Once again, the only idea is that it can resemble another idea. A color or shape isn't like another color except for how it's perceived. It's only in the perception that we're going to understand what it is. Instead of going on in different complicated philosophical talk, Berkeley says, for what is the point of hammering away at something that can be proved in a line or two, convincing anyone who is capable of the least reflection? So what do we need to do? What reflection does he call us? He says, look into your own thoughts and try to conceive, if possible, for a sound or a shape or a motion or a color to exist outside of the mind or unperceived. Can you do it? Can you think of something that you perceive as existing apart from how you perceive it? Specifically, what is identified as secondary characteristics by Locke. Can you do it? Can you? Really? Can you? Stop. Think. Pause. Come back in 2-3 minutes after giving it the good old try. We're told it is inconceivable. If it is inconceivable, then why would we persist in saying that it's possible for such things to exist outside the mind or unperceived? You already accept that things don't work as easily as they are when you concede certain scientific facts. Right? We already live in this world that things don't always make sense. Scientific ideas, quantum physics, for instance, you're like, yeah, even quantum physicists are like, yeah, it's just what it is. I don't know why, I don't know how, and I can't really explain it except for saying that it is. In fact, this is what Schrodinger's cat was used to try to explain in this larger context. We don't really understand the world around us. You've already conceded some things, like sound can't travel in the vacuum of space. You don't know how and why. I mean, okay, waves are, moving particles, etc. There's no, in the vacuum of space, there are no particles, therefore sound can't travel. Yeah, I mean, you get that. Intuitively, you can rationalize that, but yet you still watch movies with things in space and expect to hear explosions. That's still part of what you're expecting, because it's not just about what you know rationally to be there, but what you actually conceive to be the case. And you know that you have to give up on some ideas because it's just the way things are. And Berkeley would tell you, how is this any different? This simple thought experiment, he said, may make you see that what you have been defending is a downright contradiction. In fact, he says, I am willing to stake my whole position on this. If you can so much as conceive it possible for one extended movable substance, or in general for any one idea or anything like an idea to exist otherwise than in a mind perceiving it, I shall cheerfully give up my opposition to matter. If you can think of an idea existing outside of anyone's mind, he says, fine, then I can say these things exist. And if for all that great apparatus of external bodies that you argue for, I shall admit its existence, even though you cannot either give me any reason why you believe it exists or assign any use to it when it's supposed to exist. I repeat, the bare possibility of you being right will count as an argument that you are right. I love that idea. I love any philosopher saying, you know what, even if you can give me the hint of an idea that you're right, fine, you're right. I'll concede it immediately. My whole argument falls apart. But you can't. So why is it you still hold that idea? Why is it you're dogmatically holding to the idea that matter exists, Berkeley says, when you can't conceive of a sound or a shape or emotion or a color to exist outside of the mind? If everything exists in the mind, why do you need to hold to the idea that it exists in matter as well? This seems unnecessary, redundant, and counterintuitive. But you say, Berkeley continues, surely there's nothing easier than to imagine trees in a park, for instance, or books on a shelf with nobody there to perceive them. We all have trees, we have books, we know that they exist even when we're not perceiving them. I reply, this is indeed easy to imagine. But let us look at what happens when you imagine it. You form in your mind certain ideas that you call books and trees. And at the same time, you admit to form the idea of anyone who might perceive them. You're just taking ideas of trees and books, and then you're abstracting yourself or somebody else who's perceiving this out of them, and therefore eliminating the mind and the senses. And therefore the only thing that exists is the trees and the books. But is that the way that it really works? It says, while you're doing this, you perceive or think of them. So your thought experiment misses the point. It shows only that you have the power of imagining or forming ideas in your mind, but it doesn't show that you can conceive of it possible for the objects of your own thought to exist outside of the mind. However hard we try to conceive the existence of external bodies, all we achieve is to contemplate our own ideas again. Every time we want to say, no, there's no observer, there's no senses that are taking in on this. It simply is. It's just a mental abstraction, and once again, we're brought back to the idea that our senses and our mind is what's really doing this. Think about it a little, he says, and you will see what I'm saying is plainly true. There is really no need for any other disproofs of the existence of material substance. So, Berkeley continues, that is what I insist on, that this phrase, the absolute existence of unthinking things, has either no meaning or a self-contradictory one. This is what I repeat and teach and urge you to think about carefully. Trees do not exist apart from our mind perceiving them. This is where they exist. All of our ideas, sensations, things that we perceive, call them what you will, are visibly inactive. There is no power or agency in them. One idea or object of thought, therefore, cannot produce or affect another. To be convinced of this, we need only to attend to our ideas. They are wholly contained within the mind. So whatever is in them must be perceived. All of our ideas of trees or other things exist only in our mind. We perceive of a continual stream of ideas, New ones appear, and the others are changed or totally disappear. These ideas must have a cause, something they depend on, something that produces and changes them. It cannot be a corporeal or a material substance because I've already shown that there is no such thing, right? He already says that something that's making us see things coming into existence, going out of existence, changing in front of our continual streams of ideas. Matter doesn't exist. It can't be matter. Right? We must therefore conclude that the cause of ideas is an incorporeal active substance, something that doesn't have matter because matter truly doesn't exist, and there must be some substance behind this, some spirit, to use the other phrase. You can even see possibly where Hegel is getting his notion of the spirit causing all actions coming from here. Right? A spirit is an active being. It is simple in the sense that it doesn't have parts. Right? What are the parts of a spirit? It's just there, right? When thought of something that perceives it, it is called the understanding. And when thought of producing ideas or doing things with them, it is called the will. Right? These are the two agencies of the spirit, the understanding and the will. It is from our perceptions, understandings, and our will that we then arouse ideas and in effect bring existence upon objects. He continues, I find I can arouse ideas in my mind at will and vary and shift the mental scene whenever I want to. You can imagine something. You can create it out of your mind that something is going to happen. I only need to will, and straight away this or that idea arises in my mind. And by willing again, I can obliterate it and bring on another. Shows up, then it's gone. It's because the mind makes and unmakes ideas in this way that it can properly be called active. It certainly is active. We know this from experience. We'll all concede that our mind is an active thing. But anyone who talks of unthinking agents or of arousing ideas without the use of volition is merely letting himself be led astray by words. Things don't just happen apart from your willing it to happen. If you don't will it to happen, nothing matters. Nothing happens. But you may ask, what about what I perceive? Right, come on. Surely there's some sort of objective reality there, right? When in broad daylight I open my eyes, it isn't my power to choose whether or not I shall see anything, or to choose what particular objects I see. You're looking in the same spot, it's there, right? You're not choosing to see something or not. At least you're not sure you are. And the same holds for hearing and the other senses. My will is not responsible for the ideas that come to me through any of my senses. So there must be some other will, some other spirit that has produced them. The fact that everything has to be spirit, that everything has to be mind. The fact that you hear sounds that you don't will must mean that there must be another will. If somebody else makes a noise, you hear it. They have decided, they have willed, and therefore you hear it. But is that the case for everything? Is somebody else perceiving a tree and that's why you perceive the tree? If so, who did it? These thoughts must originate somewhere outside of my thoughts. These perceptions must exist somewhere else first. It's not just because you decide to look at it that it's there. Somebody else has perceived it to be there, and that's now how you're going to perceive it. The ideas of sense are stronger, livelier, and clearer than those of the imagination. You can imagine something in your head. You could imagine Bing Bong once again, standing on a table. You're not seeing it right now. It's not as lively, it's not as clear, it's not as crisp as it was when you took it in from your senses, even though you may be very familiar with it. The sense of the tree that I showed first on that last slide that was transformed into this one. What was that? What did it look like? Gosh, you've only seen it, dozens of times throughout this course, and yet you only have a vague idea of what it might look like. Now, though, if you see one, this is what your mind focuses on, right? So the senses are stronger than your own imagination. Ideas that people bring into their own minds will often be random and jumbled. But the ideas of the senses are not like that. They come in regular series and are interrelated in admirable ways that show us the wisdom and benevolence of the series author. But there must be somebody who's bringing these in here, and the fact that it's better than our own imagination must show the kindness of whoever's thoughts these are. In fact, the phrase "the laws of nature" names the set rules or established methods whereby the mind we depend on, who is God, arouses in us the idea of sense. So God perceives these things. God imagines them, to use a different phrase. And that imagination of God allows us to perceive the world around us. This is in some ways his proof for the existence of God, and is also his way of explaining the sensible world around us. They're kind of one and the same. The fact that you perceive something and that it's alive and real means indeed there must be some cause for that, and it has to be outside of you. All of our sense data comes from the mind of God. That is why we can perceive them. That is why they exist still, even if we or no other person perceives them, because things only exist in perception, and therefore what's keeping things from blinking in and out of existence means that they're contained in the mind of some being, something that is able to hold them all in place, that being we call God. Everything exists only in the mind, but not all exists only in your mind. Some things exist in the mind of God, and that is how and why the universe doesn't blink in and out of existence over and over again. We can see a very odd connection to Bonaventure here, but kind of in a reverse and different order than Bonaventure's journey of the mind into God. Right? Bonaventure's first few steps was to focus on the external world, and this approaches the visible things as items which contain God, and then consideration of visible objects as the images of God. With Berkeley, what we have is considering visible objects as thoughts of God first. The external world is the thought of God. Then we approach things as objects which are known through this other mind, through God. And then we can focus on the external world, all through notions of perception, and understand the laws of nature. We understand that God is also being in this way, which is Bonaventure's fifth step. So again, we can thank Bonaventure for many of these ideas that Berkeley is putting forward, but in a very different way, and starting with the idea that all things exist because they are perceived. So where do we get our ideas from? He states that food nourishes, sleep refreshes, and fire warms us. That to sow in the spring is the way to get a harvest in the fall. And in general, that such and such means are the way to achieve such and such ends. We know all of this not by discovering any necessary connection between our ideas, but only by observing the settled laws of nature. This is where we get things. We understand there are laws of nature. Without them, we would be utterly uncertain and confused. Right? Without this being the case, we wouldn't know about anything. We'd be random, and it would be horrible. right? And a grown man, he says, would have no more idea than a newborn infant does of how to manage himself in the affairs of life. You've observed things. You know that there's a rule and a pattern. It keeps you from being confused. This consistent, uniform working obviously displays the goodness and wisdom of God, the governing spirit whose will constitutes the laws of nature. Which, by the way, to connect this once more to Bonaventure, is his sixth step, right? That being is goodness, that we're able to understand the goodness of God because of the goodness of the world. And that doesn't mean that the world is full of good things, right? This is not the argument that he's making. But the fact that there are laws of nature shows that it's reasonable, and therefore that's good, because imagine the other side. Imagine a world where there wasn't laws of nature, where everything was just random images from one person to another, nothing consistent. That would be chaos. That would be ugliness. The fact that we're able to get images of this world shows indeed the goodness of the mind that has it. This consistent, uniform working obviously displays the goodness and wisdom of God. But there's an oddness with this that Berkeley points out. Far from leading our thoughts towards him, towards God, towards this mind, it sends them away from him in a wandering search for second causes, that is, for causes that come between God and the effects we want to explain. Right? We're wanting to understand the laws of nature and not understanding them as the thoughts of God. This is a natural impulse that we have. For when we perceive that certain ideas of sense are constantly followed by others, and we know that this isn't our doing, we immediately attribute power and agency to the ideas themselves and make one the cause of another, than which nothing can be more absurd or unintelligible. Our mind convinces us that things which are not real are real, and the unintelligible is the intelligible. We're thinking things that aren't necessarily based upon the truth of our observations. And we're thinking ourselves out of understanding the way things really are. Continuing on, he says, the ideas imprinted on the senses by the author of nature are called real things, and those that are caused by the imagination are being less regular, vivid, and constant are more properly called ideas or images of things that they copy and represent. But our sensations, however vivid and distinct they may be, are nevertheless ideas. Our sensations really are only ideas that are given to us by another. All of our ideas and all of our thoughts come from someone else, from God or other people. Your images and thoughts about Berkeley come from the reader that I produced or in the lectures that I am giving, unless you happen to have done independent research ahead of time, and then kudos to you. And even if you did do independent research, it was still given to you by the author of another book or by Berkeley himself. I don't think that last one's the case, but possibly. Continuing on, that our sensations are still ideas. He says that they exist in the mind or are perceived by it. Again, everything comes from the mind through your perception. As truly as the ideas that mind itself makes, the ideas of sense are agreed to have more reality in them, i.e. to be more strong and orderly and coherent than ideas made in the mind. But this doesn't show that they exist outside of the mind. Just because they're more orderly doesn't mean that they have a different origin or a different location. They're also less dependent upon the spirit or thinking substance that perceives them. For they are caused by the will of another, a more powerful spirit, namely God. This is the cause of these. But still they are ideas, and certainly no idea, whether faint or strong, can exist otherwise than in the mind perceiving it. Everything still exists in the mind, even if it comes from God or if it comes from yourself. it still exists only in your mind. I don't argue against the existence of any one thing that we can take in, either by sense or by reflection. He's not dismissing what your senses are or saying they're fake or false or illusionary, right, as Descartes did in his meditations. I don't in the least question that the things I see in my eyes and touch with my hands do exist, really exist, right? We all agree, I'm touching a table, I'm touching something. It truly exists. The only thing whose existence I deny is what philosophers call matter, or the corporeal substance. The thing that he dismisses, the thing that he gets rid of, is the idea that matter is the cause, instead of everything existing in the mind. What we've seen is a wide breadth of ideas coming from the English empiricists. The idea that we take in everything through our senses, and that's how we understand the world, and that there's nothing innate, is the basic framework of empiricism. But yet, where things come from and how we understand that varies quite a bit. Locke had two substances where we're going to derive things from, our mind and the matter itself. Hume doesn't have matter or mind. No substances truly exist. Everything is just simply kind of there, but not really. That's why I don't like Hume, amongst a million other reasons, right? And Berkeley kind of gives us this more nuanced perspective that you might disagree with, you might have very good reasons for disagreeing with, right? But for Berkeley, everything only exists in the mind. The mind of ourselves and in the mind of others, and in fact, the fact that you didn't blink out of existence when nobody thought of you or didn't think of yourself, right? I think, therefore I am was Descartes. If you don't think, do you not exist for a while? Was a question that many students have. Berkeley would say, you would exist because you're in the thoughts of others, namely that of God, and we're able to keep the universe moving forward within this way. It's a very different sort of perspective. Matter exists, but only as imagination, and only as the imagination of a different mind. Now, Berkeley was an Anglican priest, so he would have given other attributes to this divine mind, but if nothing else, we know that there has to be, following Berkeley, a mind that exists that is at least benevolent in that we have laws of nature that flow from this mind. We have a concrete world around us because it exists in the mind of this God. And we know that only mind exists following Berkeley. Again, this is hard. Some of us will not accept this idea at all. Hume, by the way, really did like Berkeley's argument against the idea of abstract ideas. He disagrees with Berkeley's claim that color and extension cannot be abstracted from one another, and would side with Locke on that also. But there is this question about where substance is to be found, where ideas come from. And the English have a different way of approaching things than we find on the continent, right? So we're kind of left. Do we like empiricism? Do we like rationalism? Or do we like what Kant and other idealists, such as Hegel, would do in response to this?